Okay, so let's jump right into this deep dive today. We're looking at the reaction surrounding President Biden's recent awarding of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And we're going through all these online discussions. It's a fascinating mix. We've got Reddit forums from across the political spectrum, so our conservative, our moderate politics, and we're even looking at some more niche communities like Our Destiny and Our Gen Z. So our mission today is to kind of cut through all the noise and try to figure out what's really going on with this award. Why is it causing such a stir? Is it really just about who got a medal, or does it tell us something bigger about where we are as a country right now?
What I find so interesting is how these awards are almost like a mirror. They reflect our deepest political fissures, and anxieties.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people are questioning if the Medal of Freedom has become more about celebrity than merit these days. What do you think?
Well, it definitely brings up a really interesting debate. Like, what are the criteria for receiving this award, and have they shifted over time? I mean, think about it. We've got Lionel Messi, this amazing soccer player, receiving the medal. But at the same time, we also have someone like George Soros, who's known more for his philanthropy and political activism.
Yeah, it's a pretty diverse group of people, to say the least.
Mm.
But when I'm going through these comments, there's this one question that just keeps popping up over and over, and it's, is this just an award for being famous?
Mm.
Do you think there's any truth to that? Or is it a bit more complicated than that?
I think it's definitely more nuanced than just being about fame. I mean, the Medal of Freedom has always gone to a wide range of people, from artists to politicians. And presidents have always had, some leeway in choosing who they want to give it to. And there have always been disagreements about those choices. So the real question is, has that debate just gotten louder over time, or are we just more aware of it now because of how we get our information?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Speaking of figures who spark debate, let's talk about George Soros. He's kind of a lightning rod in these online discussions, especially. Why do you think he generates such strong reactions from people?
I think it's because he's kind of become this symbol and avatar for a whole bunch of political anxieties that people have. He's a billionaire and he's a philanthropist. And he very actively supports progressive causes. And that makes him, a major target for criticism from the right, especially when it comes to his support for progressive prosecutors.
Yeah, we're seeing some really strong accusations in these threads. Some people are directly linking his support for these prosecutors to rising crime rates. One commenter even said, and I'm just going to quote this directly, George Soros is probably indirectly responsible for a multitude of murders, robberies, and other crimes through his funding of far-left district attorneys.
Wow, those are some serious accusations, and it really reflects how much distrust there is towards Soros. People are really concerned about his influence on the criminal justice system, and it taps into these bigger anxieties that people have about crime, about justice, and ultimately, who has the power to shape those things.
And this isn't the first time Soros has been right at the center of a controversy. We have to talk about Black Wednesday, that 1992 currency crisis where he shorted the British pound. There are still people who believe that he intentionally tried to undermine the UK economy. What do you make of that?
Yeah, Black Wednesday was a huge event in financial history. And it really kind of feeds into this whole narrative about Soros, this idea of him being a really powerful, maybe even shadowy figure. I think whether or not he intentionally tried to destabilize the UK economy is still debated. But the perception of him as this financial titan, capable of doing things like that, is pretty ingrained in the public consciousness.
Right, it definitely adds more fuel to the fire. And it's not just about his financial dealings. There's also a lot of discussion about his philanthropy, supporting all these organizations focused on human rights, strengthening democracy. What do you think this tells us about the bigger picture?
It really highlights how polarizing a figure he is. His critics tend to focus on the political aspects of his philanthropy. They might downplay or even dismiss the humanitarian work that he does. So Soros ends up becoming this symbol for these larger debates. Like, what is the role of wealth in politics? Should people with huge amounts of resources have this much influence on social and political issues?
That's a great point. So to some people, he's a villain, and to others, he's a hero. As you were reading through these discussions, what stood out to you? What is it about Soros in particular that seems to provoke such intense reactions?
I think it's this really unique combination of things. His wealth, his political activism, and his willingness to really challenge the status quo. For some people, he represents this threat to traditional power structures. And that's what makes him so controversial.
Okay, so we've got this really complex figure. He's a symbol of wealth and influence. And he's at the heart of this whole debate about the Medal of Freedom. And right alongside him is another figure who seems to always be in the middle of the political storm, Hillary Clinton.
Oh yeah, her inclusion in this round of awards has definitely created a lot of mixed reactions, which I guess isn't really that surprising.
Not at all. I mean, Clinton's entire political career has been marked by both significant achievements, but also some really intense criticism. And those divisions are really on full display in these online discussions. What kind of themes are you seeing emerge from these conversations?
It's interesting because it's like the same old battle lines are being drawn again. On one side, her supporters are highlighting all her work advocating for healthcare reform and, of course, all her accomplishments as Secretary of State. They see her as this trailblazer for women in politics, a really dedicated public servant.
Right, but then on the other side of the coin, we're seeing all those familiar criticisms coming up again, aren't we?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Her critics are bringing up Benghazi, that 2012 attack on the U.S. diplomatic compound in Libya, and they're also bringing up her use of a private email server while she was Secretary of State.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of anger and distrust still lingering from those events. One commenter even wrote, Hillary literally got an ambassador killed through her negligence. That's a pretty strong accusation. What do you make of comments like that?
It really shows how much staying power certain narratives can have. These events have become so ingrained in the minds of her critics. They've become these really potent symbols of what they see as her failings, even though, official investigations haven't found her directly responsible for the deaths in Benghazi. That perception of her being responsible persists.
It's almost like for some people, those events have overshadowed all the other things she's accomplished. I find it interesting how our perception of these figures can be so heavily shaped by just a few specific events, even if those events are really complex and open to different interpretations.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good reminder of how powerful narratives can be and how much they can shape our understanding of even the most complicated issues.
So we've got these two figures, Soros and Clinton, both incredibly successful in their respective fields, but also both incredibly polarizing. They seem to embody this idea of the elite, which has become such a target of resentment in recent years. What do you think it is about these figures that taps into this broader anti-elite sentiment?
Well, I think they represent this combination of wealth, power, and political influence that a lot of people find really unsettling, whether it's Soros's, huge financial empire and his support for progressive causes, or Clinton's, political dynasty and her association with kind of establishment politics. They kind of embody this system that many people feel is rigged against them.
It's, they're seen as these symbols of a system that's out of touch with the concerns of everyday Americans. And to some, giving them the Presidential Medal of Freedom just further reinforces that perception. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think there's definitely some truth to that. The perception of elitism, of a system that favors the wealthy and well-connected, is very real. And it's not just about individuals like Soros and Clinton. It's this broader sense of disillusionment with the entire political system.
So we're seeing a lot of anger, a lot of distrust, and a lot of frustration in these online discussions. And it's not just directed at the people who receive the award, but the award itself, like the very idea of what it means to be deserving of this honor.
Yeah, I think that's really the next layer to this whole discussion. It's not just about the individuals. It's about this perceived devaluation of the medal itself.
Exactly. And that seems to be where this conversation gets really interesting, because it raises all these questions about what we value as a society, who we choose to elevate, and what those choices say about us.
It's about whether the Medal of Freedom still carries the same weight, the same symbolic power that it once did.
Right, and whether it's become, as some people are saying, just another partisan trinket, like a meaningless gesture in this incredibly divided political landscape. But before we get too deep into that, I want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your initial thoughts on all of this? What stands out to you about these reactions? Are Soros and Clinton figures that you view favorably, or are you more aligned with those who see them as problematic? We'll be right back to continue this discussion after a quick break.
It's really kind of wild how this one award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, can spark such a huge range of emotions and opinions.
It does feel like everyone's kind of searching for some deeper meaning, trying to figure out what the hidden message is behind who gets chosen.
And that in itself is really revealing, right? I mean, it tells us something about where we are as a society right now. Everything feels so politically charged these days. It's hard to look at anything simply at face value.
It's like we're constantly looking for some kind of political Rorschach test in everything, even in something that's supposed to be about celebrating achievement. So let's get back to this question that keeps coming up. Has the Medal of Freedom lost its significance? A lot of these comments we're looking at seem to think so.
There's definitely a sense that it's been devalued, like it's become just another tool for each administration to reward their allies and score political points.
And that's kind of a shame, right? Because
Yeah.
it's really meant to recognize truly exceptional contributions. We're talking about people like Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, individuals who undeniably changed the world.
Yeah, those names definitely carry a lot of weight. I think it's easy to get caught up in the partisan back and forth, to just focus on the recipients we disagree with, and then view the entire award through that lens.
Right. But maybe we need to step back for a second and remember that there are often many deserving people who receive this medal, even if their names don't spark as much controversy.
This year, for instance, we have Michael J. Fox, who has been incredibly dedicated to advocating for Parkinson's research. And then you have Denzel Washington, a celebrated actor and philanthropist. They may not be generating the same heated debates as, say, a Soros or a Clinton, but their contributions are still incredibly significant.
That's a good point. It's a good reminder that we don't have to agree with every single choice, to still appreciate the value of the award itself. And it's a reminder to be careful about making sweeping judgments, just based on a few controversial decisions.
Exactly. I mean, if we just write off the entire award as meaningless, then we risk losing sight of the genuine achievements that it's supposed to honor.
So let's talk about that idea of achievement for a minute. Another interesting thing that keeps coming up in these discussions is this question of what makes a contribution worthy of this kind of recognition. It seems pretty subjective, doesn't it?
Oh, it is definitely subjective. There's no one definition of merit, no objective way to measure someone's impact. What one person might see as a remarkable achievement, another person might completely dismiss. It really all comes down to your values and your perspective.
Right. For some people, it's all about tangible accomplishments, things like scientific breakthroughs, artistic masterpieces, building successful businesses. But for others, it's more about social impact, like fighting for human rights, advocating for social justice, working to improve their communities.
And then there are those who focus more on character, things like integrity, courage, compassion. So with all these different criteria floating around, it's no wonder that people have such different opinions about who deserves to be recognized. It really makes you think, what do you personally consider a worthy contribution? Is it more about concrete achievements? Or is it something less tangible, like character or impact on a community?
That's a great question. It's easy to get so caught up in our own perspectives and just dismiss other people's opinions as wrong. But I think it's important to remember that there's usually some deeper logic behind people's thinking, even if we don't ultimately agree with their conclusions.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes doing these deep dives so fascinating. It forces us to confront these really complex questions and consider viewpoints that we might not normally encounter in our everyday lives.
And speaking of encountering different viewpoints, one thing that really jumped out at me while I was reading through these sources was just how much misinformation and how many conspiracy theories are floating around online. It's a little alarming, to be honest.
It is concerning. It's kind of scary how quickly these things can spread,
Yeah.
especially when you add in the fact that political discussions tend to be so heated. We're seeing comments about, Clinton's emails and Benghazi, stuff that's been debunked over and over again. But people are still sharing it as if it's fact.
It's almost like we're living in this alternate reality
Yeah.
where evidence just doesn't carry the same weight anymore.
And that's really dangerous because it undermines our ability to have productive conversations and to make informed decisions as a society. If we can't even agree on a basic set of facts, how can we even begin to solve problems together?
It feels like a huge problem. What can we even do to combat this tide of misinformation?
Well, it starts with education and critical thinking. We need to help people develop the skills to evaluate information properly, to recognize bias and propaganda, to be able to separate fact from fiction. It's about asking questions, looking for evidence, and considering multiple perspectives.
That sounds great in theory, but how do you actually do that in practice? I mean, people are bombarded with information from all sides these days. It's hard to know what to trust.
You're right, it's definitely not easy. But we have to start somewhere. I think we need to encourage people to be more skeptical, to really think critically about what they're reading and hearing online, especially if it's coming from a source that has a clear agenda.
So it's not about just blindly trusting everything you see. It's about developing the ability to think for yourself.
Exactly. And that's where education comes in. We need to teach media literacy skills, especially to young people. Help them learn how to navigate this increasingly complex information landscape. It's not just about being able to spot fake news. It's about understanding how information is produced, how it's shared, and sometimes how it's manipulated.
So it's about becoming an active participant in that whole information process, not just a passive consumer.
Exactly. And that requires not just knowledge, but self-awareness. We need to be able to recognize our own biases and how those biases might be influencing our understanding of events.
So being willing to challenge our own assumptions and be open to different viewpoints, even if they make us a little uncomfortable. I mean, that's how we grow, right? Both individually and as a society.
Yeah, I think so. That's how we create a more informed and engaged public. A public that's capable of making sound judgments and holding its leaders accountable.
And maybe, just maybe, that's how we start to restore some of that lost significance to the Presidential Medal of Freedom. If we can elevate the quality of our national discourse, maybe we can shift the focus back to what really matters, honoring genuine achievement and celebrating the values that unite us as a country.
That's a really great point. It's not just about the medal itself, it's about what it represents. It's about our shared values, our aspirations as a nation. And that brings us back to this whole idea of wealth and power in America. It's a theme that keeps coming up again and again in these discussions.
Okay, let's dig into that a little bit. Why do you think it's such a hot-button issue right now?
Well, we're seeing people on both sides of the political spectrum expressing concerns about the influence of billionaires and special interest groups. Some on the left criticize Soros for using his wealth to advance a progressive agenda, while those on the right might point to someone like Ralph Lauren and claim that the award is just a perk for the elite.
So it's almost like there's this growing resentment toward the concentration of wealth and power, regardless of which side of the political aisle you're on.
That's exactly what it seems like. There's this feeling that the system is rigged against them,
Mm-hmm.
that their voices aren't being heard and their concerns aren't being addressed. And they see awards like this as a symbol of that disconnect. It's like a way for the elite to pat themselves on the back while ignoring the struggles of everyday Americans.
And it doesn't seem to be just a partisan issue either. We're seeing people from all walks of life expressing these anxieties about the state of our democracy and the role of wealth and power within it.
You're right, it does seem to be transcending those traditional partisan lines, and I think that suggests there's this deep yearning for change, a desire for a system that feels more responsive to the needs of ordinary people. It makes you wonder, what are your thoughts on this? Do you share these concerns about the influence of wealth and power? Do you think it's shaping the reactions to these awards? We'll be right back to continue this discussion after a quick break.
So welcome back to the show. As we keep unpacking these reactions to the Presidential Medal of Freedom, there's one more thing we need to look at: the media.
Right, because it plays such a huge role. I mean, the way we see these awards, the people who get them, it's all shaped by how it's presented in the news, online, everywhere.
Exactly. And it's not just like the traditional news outlets anymore. We're talking about everything. Social media, those forums, podcasts, the whole thing. It's honestly a bit overwhelming sometimes.
It really is like a constant flood of information coming at you from every direction. It's hard to even know where to start sometimes, let alone trying to figure out what's real, what's biased, and what's just completely made up.
And that's where things get really tricky, right? We all come to this with our own biases, our own favorite news sources, the people we tend to trust more.
It's true. We tend to gravitate towards the stuff that already confirms what we believe, and that's what creates those echo chambers. We end up only hearing one side of the story.
And that just makes everything more polarized, doesn't it? We dig in even deeper, and we're less and less likely to even consider other viewpoints.
Absolutely. It makes having those nuanced conversations we were talking about before so much harder. If everyone's working from a completely different set of facts, how do we even find any common ground?
It's a tough problem, so how do we break out of these echo chambers? How can we become a little bit smarter about the information we're taking in?
Okay, so first of all, I think it's really important to remember that no single news source is perfect. I mean, everyone has a perspective, an angle, a certain way of telling the story.
Right, it's like that old saying, there are three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth, which is somewhere in the middle.
Exactly. So be critical of everything you read and hear, even if it's coming from a source you usually agree with. Don't just take it at face value, dig a little deeper.
So we should always be looking for evidence, checking if other sources are reporting the same thing, and trying to find different perspectives on the same issue.
Yeah, exactly. And be willing to question your own assumptions. If something sounds a little too good to be true or just way too crazy to believe, it probably is. I think fact-checking is more important now than ever before.
It's easy to get caught up in those really emotionally charged stories, but those aren't always the most accurate.
Sometimes the truth is way more complicated than a catchy headline or a viral tweet. So dig a little deeper, ask some questions, and don't be afraid to change your mind. especially if you find evidence that goes against what you originally thought.
And be open to hearing from people who think differently than you. Even if you completely disagree with them, you never know. You might learn something new.
Totally. You might even start to understand why they believe what they believe. And that's how we start to bridge these huge divides.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, right? We each have a responsibility to create a more informed public.
Because ultimately, a healthy democracy really depends on an informed and engaged citizenry. So as we wrap up this deep dive today, let's quickly go over some key takeaways.
Okay, first up, remember that these reactions to the Presidential Medal of Freedom are just a small piece of a much bigger conversation. A conversation about our nation's values, our priorities, what we consider important.
And don't let all the negativity and online drama distract you from the fact that there are so many people out there working incredibly hard to make a positive difference in the world.
Second, always be critical of all media, especially those sources that tend to just reinforce what you already believe.
Challenge yourself to seek out diverse viewpoints, even if they make you a little uncomfortable. Have those tough conversations, even when you disagree.
And finally, never forget that knowledge really is power.
Stay curious, stay informed, and use your voice to advocate for the changes that you want to see.
Because your voice matters,
Mm.
and you really do have the power to make a difference. That's it for our deep dive this week. Thanks so much for listening.
We hope this has given you some food for thought, and maybe even inspired you to keep exploring these really complex issues.